How did the Lord of the Rings influence the early days of Dungeons and Dragons? Appendix N Chat is a series where I talk about through the official sources cited by Gary Gygax in the Dungeon Master's Guide for First Edition. I talk about how different literary sources influence the development of early D&D. The Lord of the Rings is a very important one. I think it's interesting because Gary Gygax spent a lot of time, as time went on, trying to say it wasn't a very important one, because he had legal problems with the Tolkien estate over copyright breaches. Not the first time or the last, I think, that early TSR ran into that kind of problem. But yeah, the Lord of the Rings is a big influence on D&D. You could say Conan and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser are big thematic influences as well as several specific influences, and it's really obvious that you can see the kinds of adventures they have, and a lot of the tone comes into D&D. And there's others like Three Hearts and Three Lions, which I'll mention again in this video, which are very important for specific reasons too. And there's all kinds of Elric as well, obviously. But Lord of the Rings is, along with probably Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and Conan, I would say they're the big three influences on the real shape in terms of characters, monsters, types of adventures that you get in D&D in the 70s and early 80s. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to divide this into two sections, and there's plenty to mention, and I won't go into insane detail on each point I bring up, but there's things which there's a strong influence from D&D on, like it's really drawing from, and then things where there is a weaker influence, like it's one of several perhaps. And there will be ones I miss, ones I haven't remembered, haven't thought about, haven't kind of come across as I've been reading, so please add those in the comments too. Okay, so let's start. A big influence you find from Lord of the Rings is on monsters, including on characters and demi-humans, things like that. Monsters, magic items, particularly, those are the two things that Lord of the Rings gives. So let's start. The way that Orcs and Goblins are portrayed is Orcs and Goblins, both folklore creatures originally, distinct folklore creatures probably. Goblins come up in Three Hearts and Three Lions, but Orcs and Goblins as a type of Orc or vice versa, as this sort of thuggish, chaotic in one sense. They start as lawful, of course, alignment-wise, but in the sense of they are bullying and rough and form vast hordes. That is something that you feel comes much stronger from Lord of the Rings, particularly the inclusion of orcs in that list. So Orcs and Goblins, as we have them in D&D, very much a Tolkienian influence with a bit of Anderson. Treants, Tree Men. Well, Treants are obviously based on Ents. That's part of the name. The hint is in the name. They are intelligent tree men, shepherds, defenders of forests. That is an obvious takeover from Tolkien. Balrogs, or rather I should say Type 6 demons, Balors. They were called Balrogs, that was one of the copyright issues. Balors are just Balrogs. The art even gives it away most of the time. So Type 6 demons, Balors, are Balrogs. They're demons of flame, and that of course is based on the idea of the fallen angel subclass who join Morgoth and are known as Balrogs. Halflings, particularly halflings as sneaky burglar types. Well, again, they are originally in D&D and OD&D, original D&D, called hobbits. That is the demi-human type they are. And they are kind of perhaps rotund, cheerful fellows, but also very sneaky. Well, that's Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit, pretty obviously. Giant spiders. This is a weaker influence in some ways because giant animals are common across folklore, and you could argue that most D&D giant spiders are not poisonous. But the idea of giant spiders as a regular common foe definitely reminds one of those that Bilbo and the dwarves meet in Mirkwood. Glowing magic swords. The common thing of, though it is not a direct replica, the fact that Sting and technically other elven weapons glow blue when they're near orcs, relatively near at least, that seems to me to be the obvious through line to glowing magic swords, the idea that you have a weapon that glows in the dark, and that is of course in D&D terms a solution to dark dungeons. Intelligent giant eagles. Giant eagles, again, common in, well, giant animals in general common in folklore, but giant eagles particularly are a thing that comes up in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion, and in the Lord of the Rings, you know, and the Hobbit, they're intelligent, and in D&D they are sometimes seen as intelligent in a way that other giant animals are not. That would seem again to be a direct takeover from Middle-earth. The Ranger class, Aragorn is the official basis of the Ranger class pretty clearly. I think that's one of the ones that that Gygax was willing to continue recognising. Rangers are monster hunters who defend the civilised lands by living out in the wilderness. It's the Dunedain, it's the Northern Rangers. Rings of Invisibility, that's just the Ring of Power. Now, Rings of Invisibility do not normally get made by a Dark Lord in D&D, but the idea that they are very powerful, and maybe cursed, of course, that's semi-common. That's very much both of those are, all of those things are D&D, drawing on Lord of the Rings. Dwarves and Elves and Half-Elves, basically the rest of the demi-humans. So we've said halflings, not gnomes, I guess. What gnomes are exactly and what they do in D&D is it varies and is disputable, but they are drawn from other folklore. They're not in Middle-earth. But technically, Tolkien called the early elves gnomes, but Gygax wouldn't have known that, of course. Dwarves, elves, half-elves. Half-elves, well, that's Elrond and his family, and other ones known as half-elves. The idea that elves and humans are the same species in Lord of the Rings. They are biologically identical, but with different spiritual fates and different whatevers, the dooms or blessings of Eru to them. In Lord of the Rings, they are the same species, and in D&D they can interbreed. Orcs, of course, if we see orcs, and again, Gygax wouldn't really have known this, would he necessarily? But if orcs are corrupted elves, then half orcs can be seen as a carryover from that. But I wouldn't have thought so. I think half orc is a separate takeover from Tolkien talking about half orcish men who are not probably not actually half orcs. But yeah, half elves, half orcs for different reasons. Dwarves and elves. Well, dwarves and elves exist in folklore, but as civilized, organized, noble, good beings, they are an invention of Tolkien in the modern legendarium. Elves are noble, organized. They are sad very often. They are artistic. They live in forest realms, not just in forests. Mythical elves, folklore elves have often lived in forests and places like that, but they live in forest realms, living in trees indeed. All of that stuff, Tolkien, whether it's via the Noldor or and the kind of Elrond style elf, or whether it's via Lorien with the trees, with the tree platforms and beautiful trees, or whether it's a slightly more sinister, more traditional elf with Thranduil of Mirkwood in The Hobbit, particularly. Obviously, Legolas brings along his own people's bigotries, and they are undone in the Lord of the Rings. Dwarves, similarly, the idea that you've got little men who live in the ground and are craftsmen, that's it. That's a folklore, mythical thing. But the idea that they have great realms burrowed under the ground with great armour, mailed legions, and the fact that they make mithril armour. Mithril, of course, is a Tolkienian thing brought over into D&D. That's all Tolkien. To the degree to which they are perceived as almost pathologically prone to greed, not to evil in other respects, but to greed, that's very Tolkienian. And you see that with the question of the 7 rings of power, the dwarven rings, which, rather than turning those dwarf lords to follow Sauron, like the 9 rings do, the 7 rings tempt to greed and corruption. What he cannot get directly, he'll get indirectly. So dwarves, as we have them in D&D, are an invention of Tolkien. White is a Anglo-Saxon word, an early English word meaning man. It did not mean an undead thing. It came to have a more negative connotation, I think, later on. But Tolkien has barrow wights who are directly taken over. The idea that a wight drains power from the person it attacks with its touch, its chill touch, is a Tolkienian idea. The idea that they're evil spirits in the bodies of the dead is a Tolkienian idea. Now, of course, exactly what wights are in Tolkien, it seems they are just corpses which evil spirits have come and possessed. In D&D, that's not necessarily clear. What intelligent undead actually are is well, it has various explanations in D&D. But yeah, so wights, direct takeover. Wargs/wargs, direct takeover. The idea of them as wolves. Well, I mean, it's I think actually functionally originally a word that means wolf or wolfskin or something like that. But as a kind of giant wolf, that is a Tolkien thing. Anderson in Three Hearts and Three Lions does use it to describe a werewolf. And you can see that is a very influential book on Gygax too. But yes, so warg/warg, another direct takeover. Now, I'm going to offer four slightly more looser influences that I think are definitely there. But I think there are other sources, or they are less important. So the first is epic quest adventures. If you have a module which it says you've been called by the king to go and do this great quest, of course there are many other sources for the epic quest. So in that sense, there are other sources, but really that as a modern trope comes from Lord of the Rings, and that sounds like a dramatic claim until you realise that fantasy literature from the 70s functionally is for a long time only a response to Lord of the Rings. You see that with Shannara, Thomas Covenant, The Dark Tower. The Wheel of Time, Sword of Truth even to some degree, and all the other, and I'm talking really about the influence on American authors who suddenly discover Tolkien in the 60s and 70s and want to write their own version, and that comes from the very derivative, some Shannara, the first book of Wheel of Time, to the very original Thomas Covenant and Dark Tower. But yeah, the epic quest where one has there's an evil at the end of the line, Lord Foul or the Red King, or whatever else. The idea there might be magical items which are key to this quest. Those are things that are very much drawn from Tolkien, and that in the literature Gygax was reading will be clearest in Tolkien. The one qualification I have to give to that is that this is not a strong theme in earliest D&D of adventures. There are very few modules actually where the setup is, there are ones where you come across a problem and you have to solve it, or someone asks you to go and defeat an evil. That's common in itself, certainly, but it is not common as a superstructure where you've got a module involving a great quest to destroy a magic item. That would be an obvious one. The Hobbit, I guess you could say the quest format in The Hobbit, of there are bad guys in a place and you're hired to go and help the people clear it out. That comes up, but less often. Usually the setups are more system neutral, setting neutral than that. You see it become a lot more important in later D&D. You are hired to go and do this great quest. You do see it in a few modules. The two that I could think of, three I could think of from first edition. Arguably, there's some stuff in Oriental Adventures too, which kind of maps to this, but is obviously also drawn on other sources. But the fix-up for A1 to 4, Scourge of the Slave Lords, there is definitely a degree of you are literally brought in to deal with an evil secret menace by the local leaders. You become this company going out to deal with this. The actual format of the adventure doesn't closely match that, but the framing devices do. Queen of the Demon Web Pits. Well, you end the TAGD line with the Q1, and in that line of stories, which T1 to 4, very loose framing device, G1 to 3, yes, you're going on quest to go and do stuff, but they're base assaults and it's not really presented as a great quest, it's just a go and kill some bad guys. And D, similarly, you're just trying to find out what's going on. There's not an obvious endpoint at the start. It's a mystery discovery where you're trying to find out where these drow have come from. But Q is, you have to go and stop Lolth's plans. You have to go and defeat her. And though it's a flawed module, and only sketched by Gygax, finished by Sutherland, it has more of that sense of this is the high-level epic quest. The other one I could think of that fits this, and it's partly because it fits the folklore model, is Beyond the Crystal Cave, UK 5. Is it UK 5? UK 1, Beyond the Crystal Cave. I think 5 is all that glitters. But yeah, Beyond the Crystal Cave, and as I say, the bleed here is to folklorish tales. You go through into the magical land to try to rescue the teenagers who have gone through. And though it's not an epic quest, it has the quest format. There are other examples in the early days which you can find, and they become increasingly obvious into the 80s. Tracy Hickman, DL1, and Ravenloft, I5 is that. Those both obviously have elements of that, and it becomes more and more, and the Hickman line is the place where the epic quest takes over as the framing, often to the detriment of the adventure. A second influence, well, and the remaining influences are simpler. Trolls, 3 lions and 3 hearts, or 3 hearts and 3 lions, that's really where it comes from, the fire vulnerable troll. But there are trolls in the Hobbit, and the idea of trolls as sort of coextant with greenskins, not that they're green in these books, but with Orcs and Goblins, that's a Lord of the Rings-ish thing, really. Dragons, folklore dragons, fire-breathing worms and dragons, incredibly common in the West and in the East, but the specific picture of the dragon on a hoard in a mountain, though not original to the Hobbit, is, I think, pretty clearly drawn from the Hobbit. That is a common thing for the red dragon, is a Hobbit-esque thing. You could see it in the fact that some dragons early on in D&D, I mean, and later, but early on particularly, may riddle or discuss and talk. That idea is obviously also Smaug. And the influence on wizards, again, not closely, but I think it's fair to say that the idea of orders of wizards, definitely something you'll draw from Tolkien. Different robed colours for wizards, different abilities for wizards, different schools of magic. These are things which are not wholly unique to Tolkien, but those things, and magic staffs and stuff, you could see passing through to, I'd say magic rings in general as a Tolkien thing, but coming through to Gygax. Of course, the idea of the wizard is really Merlin ultimately, and the idea of the wizards that you actually get in D&D with the kinds of powers they have, well, Vance, obviously for the spell format, but generally speaking, the way that good magic works in Tolkien is sympathetic or indirect, or occasionally explosive, but in ways that people around don't understand what's going on. It's not entirely, you're like, what's just happened? That's strange. So the actual D&D wizard draws mechanically much more on Vance and on the Arthuriad, but I think there is an influence there from Tolkien as well on robed wizards with different powers and things like that. So that is my list of influences I can divine. I'm pretty sure there are others. I'm sure you can tell me more in the comments, but yeah, it is a very influential book, or if you count The Hobbit, 2 books. Anyway, that's me for now. Add your own in the comments. Till next time.